Thank you, David. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be back in Glenties, and my sincere thanks to Joe for the invitation. As we all painfully know, over the last 5 years, successive Irish governments have been hiking taxes and cutting spending to try to reduce the budget deficit. And those policies, tax hikes, spending cuts, introduced at a time when the economy is extremely weak, as it has been over the last 5 years, is what's commonly known as austerity. And of course, we haven't just seen austerity in Ireland, we've seen austerity right across Europe. And what I'm going to argue this afternoon is that although painful for the citizens of this country, the austerity of the large-scale fiscal consolidation that we've experienced since the bursting of the property bubble has been absolutely necessary to prevent outright national insolvency and a much worse situation than we face today. You commonly hear that things couldn't possibly worse. Well, they could be a lot worse, and they are in some countries. Without those adjustments over the last 5 years, there would be no prospect for economic recovery in this country. And looking forward, the government, I think, should continue in its efforts to restore order to the public finances. Although, given that much progress has been made, I think there is a legitimate debate about the optimal pace of fiscal consolidation over the next few years. So, in other words, what I'm going to argue is that the scale and pace of fiscal consolidation in Ireland has, I think, been about right over the last 5 years. But and here I would agree with Jack O'Connor. I'm also going to argue that there's been too much austerity in euro area as a whole. Europe must do more to promote economic growth right across the euro area, in Ireland and in the other peripheral euro area crisis countries. But I'm also going to talk about how important it is that we don't rely entirely on help from abroad. So a key message of my remarks this afternoon would be that Ireland could and should do more to help ourselves. And the session is about looking forward, but I just want to briefly just go backwards and go back to 2008 and ask the question, wouldn't the best course of action in 2008 have been to avoid austerity, leave the tax system as it was, and leave public spending untouched? Would that have been the right way to go? After all, most economists favour what's called counter-cyclical fiscal policy to support economic activity during a short-lived temporary downturn. Short-lived temporary. These policies can be very effective in large, essentially closed economies like the United States or the euro area as a whole. And under those sort of policies, counter-cyclical policy, a budget deficit would be allowed to persist. A gap between spending and revenue would be allowed to persist, typically for several years, without policymakers raising taxes and cutting spending, because the policymakers and the debt markets, the people who lend the money to fund that gap, can be confident that the deficit will automatically shrink when the economy recovers from whatever temporary shock caused the recession. And I'm using words like automatically and temporary very deliberately. That's the policy, and it's a sensible policy. But that's most assuredly not the situation that faced Ireland in the aftermath of the bursting of the bubble in 2008. We weren't facing a temporary shock that was going to go away by itself. If you think of many of the shocks, let's say an oil shock that hits the global economy, puts economies into recession, but because the global economy goes into recession, oil prices then fall and everything reverses. And so all the jobs that were lost, they all come back. And sure, you can run a budget deficit during that period of time because you know that it's all going to reverse. That's not what Ireland faced in 2008. The property bubble was not going to reinflate, and the economic activity and the government revenues associated with that bubble were gone forever, permanently. We know that at the height of the bubble in 2007, at least 1 in every €3 of government revenues were generated by the property boom. Those revenues included, for example, capital gains on speculative land, VAT on housing supplies, stamp duties. And on top of that, then, there was all the revenues, the income tax that were being earned by all the construction workers. That was a bubble generating a massive amount of revenues, but it was a temporary revenue for the government. What did the government, during the boom years, do with those temporary windfall revenues? Well, they were used during the boom years to cut income tax and to fund a surge in spending on public sector pay and social benefits. So that level of public spending was affordable only if the bubble continued to inflate forever. It couldn't, and it didn't. As a kid, I always liked watching movies where, let's say, some kidnappers would kidnap somebody, and then they'd ring and they'd say, if you want this person released, the ransom, it's $1 million. It doesn't seem much now, $1 million, and we want it in unmarked bills. I always remember that phrase, unmarked bills. Somehow they don't say that anymore. But I was thinking about that unmarked bills. One way to think about what was happening here during the bubble years was to think about not unmarked bills, but marked bills. Let's say 50 euro notes. And let's say you could mark them, and what you do is you'd stamp them and mark them with, I don't know, some bank, let's say Anglo-Irish Bank. So every 50 euro note that Anglo borrowed abroad from German savers, from international capital markets, and brought into this country, we'd stamp that with a 50, with a picture of Anglo-Irish Bank. And then the issue is, where did all those 50s go, those marked notes? Well, they went in here, by and large, into our wallets, everybody's wallets. The government was cutting taxes, giving those 50s to everybody. Tax rates were lower than they should have been. They were increasing public sector pay, increasing social benefits. They were dishing out these 50s. The government was taking a big slice of the action, the money coming in, borrowed by the banks. The government took a big share and dished it out. And once the banks stopped borrowing abroad, they couldn't borrow any money. That money was no longer coming in, and we had the crash. That's the reality. It's an uncomfortable reality, but it's a reality. People seem to have this disconnect between what the banks were doing and the extra disposable income that was ending up in our pockets, but there is no disconnect. They were absolutely related. When the bubble burst, revenues collapsed and a huge structural budget deficit emerged. Structural. The nature of that deficit, a structural deficit, meant that it would not go away unless actions were taken to broaden the tax base and reduce public spending to sustainable levels. So an economic strategy that involves running an annual budget deficit of, let's say, 15 billion permanently is a fast track to national ruin. Of course, a deficit of that size cannot be eliminated in 1 or 2 years. To minimise the depressing effects on the economy and employment, deficit reduction in this country has been gradual. We mightn't think that way, but it has been. Particularly if you compare it to other euro area crisis countries. They have done a lot more austerity in a much shorter period of time. We have done austerity, but it's been spread out, and that's given the economy some oxygen and some chance to try to recover. That approach in Ireland contrasts with the fiscal adjustment programmes in other euro area economies, which began later and, mistakenly in my opinion, involved more severe spending cuts over a shorter period of time. Pro-cyclical fiscal policy during the boom meant, unfortunately, that fiscal policy was inevitably pro-cyclical during the bust. The good news, I think, as Brian Hayes mentioned last night, is that the bulk of the work in rebuilding our tax base and reducing public spending to sustainable levels appears to have been done. And markets appear to see it that way. As John Moore mentioned earlier, our long-term borrowing costs are now below 4%. In recent weeks, we've seen a lively debate on when the government should scale back on the roughly $5 billion in planned austerity over the next 2 years. I think there are good arguments on both sides, $4 billion or $5 billion. Determining the optimal speed of fiscal adjustment is never an easy task. It is not the case that the more austerity, the better. There's always a trade-off. You want to get the budget deficit down, but you don't want to do too much in too short a period of time. I remember in autumn of 2008 going out to Brussels with Brian Lenihan. It was a meeting, it was a very hurriedly arranged, hush-hush meeting. I particularly remember going to the airport in the car, a group of us, and we were told to turn off our phones. And the reason was that a lot of journalists, quite a few journalists in the room, journalists had, for example, the press secretary's phone number. And since this meeting was not scheduled, if they rang it, they would get a foreign dial tone. And quite a few journalists seemed to have Brian Lenihan's mobile number as well. So they would then ring him, and of course they'd also get a foreign dial tone. And then they might ring his political advisor, and if they had it, they might even ring his economic advisor, your man from Galway, Ahearne. And they get all these foreign dial tones, and they'd say, what's going on here? So we all turned off the phones, and Brian Lanyon didn't turn off the phone. He left it on, but he left it with his driver in the airport who didn't travel. But the purpose of that meeting was to meet European authorities, and they wanted the 2011 budget to be an 8 billion adjustment. 8 billion. And Brian Lennon argued that it was just too much. Yes, the budget deficit had to be reduced. Significant budget consolidation was needed for the reasons I spoke about. But he said two things. 8 billion is too much. It will just kill the economy. Too much medicine will kill the patient. And secondly, he said politically he wouldn't be able to deliver that. And he said no Irish government will be able to do a budget of that scale. So it turned out the budget for 2011 was 5.3 billion. There was an extra 700 billion of essentially accounting transactions, but it was a 5.3 billion budget. I tell you that because it illustrates that there is a trade-off. It's not the case that the more the merrier. There is, and I think successive Irish governments have been cognizant of that there is an optimal pace of doing the fiscal consolidation, and that will certainly be a factor in over coming months in determining whether 4 or 5 billion is the right number. A more radical approach was recently suggested by former IMF economist Ashoka Modi. Under his plan, the government will announce a 3-year suspension of all austerity policies. The hope would be that without austerity, the economy would grow at a rate sufficiently strong to boost tax revenues and lower spending on unemployment assistance, and thereby reduce the budget deficit and public debt as a share of GDP. That plan might work, but I think it would only have a chance of working if it's backed by significant support from Europe. After all, austerity is only one factor weighing on economic activity in Ireland. Recession in our main trading partners, things are very bad, particularly in the euro area, and ongoing problems in our banking sector, among other things, are also depressing growth. So if that plan, the Modi plan, is to have a shot at success, then first it must be part of a European-wide strategy to boost growth right across the euro area. The European Central Bank, which in fairness has been doing a lot of new initiatives over the last few years, working in cooperation with Europe's Rescue Fund, the ESM, could be, I think, more innovative in its lending programs, which may help to increase SMEs' access to finance. In addition, public investment is very low in the euro area at the moment by historical levels, and it could be boosted in some countries which have more room to manoeuvre on the fiscal side. I'm thinking about Germany and the Netherlands, Austria, and some other countries like that. They don't have a very large structural deficit like we do, so they have more room to manoeuvre. The European Investment Bank, as John Moran said earlier, has been much more active of late, but I think that they could do more. So there would have to be a plan to get growth going right across the European economy, if we were to follow the Modi plan. Secondly, if growth did not pick up as hoped, and it might not, then under the Modi plan the state would accumulate even more debt than is currently envisaged, and our public debt would almost certainly have to be restructured. Therefore, if it's to have a chance of working, the Modi plan would have to be accompanied by a new European programme that would automatically deliver some sort of debt relief to Ireland in the event that growth remains sluggish. There was a fascinating article in the Financial Times 2 days ago, and I hadn't been aware of this, about 16th century Spain, their debt contracts, and the Spanish government had borrowed money, but the amount that got repaid, the interest rate and the maturity term, depended on events, things that happened. So, for example, if the silver fleet from the Americas was small, which was bad for the Spanish government's ability to repay, then automatically the interest rates would fall and the maturity would be stretched out. So in other words, it wasn't a straight borrowing of debt contracts. There were debt contracts where the repayment, the amount to be repaid, depended on how things turned out. It was contingent on outcomes, or so-called contingent claims. And that sort of thing in Europe, I think, may be very useful. And particularly if we're going to do the Modi plan, we'd have to have something like that in place. Irrespective of whether austerity is suspended in Europe, and I doubt that it will, a new framework for debt and for orderly debt restructuring in Europe involving such contingent claims as I talked about Spain in the 16th century would be beneficial given the very large levels of debt, both public and private, in the euro area periphery. We don't know whether debt levels across the periphery of Europe are sustainable or not. We'll eventually know. They may or may not be. It depends on events, my dear boy, events. But we don't want to have disorderly restructurings and defaults, arbitrary hits across Europe. There should be an orderly framework for doing that. Actions at the European level, therefore, will be critical for recovery in Ireland. But there are resources here at home that we could perhaps use more effectively to better position Ireland to take advantage of a European recovery if and when it comes. As Jack O'Connor mentioned, we have €6.5 billion in the Ireland Strategic Investment Fund to invest in the productive economy. We do need to be careful with that, though, not that we learn the lessons of Japan, for example, and Japan's failed attempt to stimulate its economy using public investment following their property crash in the early 1990s. What the Japanese did is that they did a huge public investment, which did prevent the economy from shrinking, but they turned out that a few years later they had spent all this money and they had very little to show for it. They built infrastructure they didn't really need. These are the so-called famous bridges to nowhere. So if we're going to do these investments, we've got to be very careful about what we're investing in. We need to think about very carefully what the proper criteria are. Investment has to be aimed at boosting the competitiveness of the enterprise sector. A bad criterion is that it's something we can do very quickly. I can think of lots of things you can spend money on very quickly. They won't be much good for the long-term productive capacity of this economy. So in that regard, I hope that the term shovel-ready projects will no longer feature as part of that debate. Let me conclude. Our most valuable stock of capital, however, is not financial. We have stocks of human capital and intangible business capital that are amongst the highest in the world. Very well-educated, well-trained workforce, particularly compared to other countries in peripheral Europe. And we are a good place to do business. We have a business-friendly environment. In reducing our budget deficit, we must not allow those stocks to depreciate. As Richard Curran said here yesterday, we must focus on creating sustainable value. That is our best hope of return to sustainable growth. Thank you.